We're very lucky today, though, to have Peter Martin. Peter is the defense policy and intelligence reporter for Bloomberg News. His previous writing has appeared in a number of impressive and prestigious outlets: Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, The National Interest, Christian Science Monitor, The Diplomat, so on and so forth. He has degrees from Oxford University, the London School of Economics, and Peking University. But most importantly, he's here to talk today about his new book, which is published by Oxford University Press and is called China's Civilian Army: The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. It's released in the US now, and in the UK this month, I believe, is the scheduled release. Very lucky to have Peter. He's going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes about his book, then leave plenty of time for questions and answers. If you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I will pick them out and give them to Peter. So with that, I will just say again, welcome you, and welcome you, Peter, and over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for hosting me. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I came to write the book. And then get into some of the arguments and findings, and I'm really pleased that we've got lots of time for questions, because that's always by far the most enjoyable part of the process. So I arrived back in China in 2017. I previously lived there on and off from 2008, and it was very striking when I arrived back to see just the extraordinary economic and technological and military progress that the country had made. Xi Jinping, China's president, was rolling out the Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative across the world. China was on the cusp of announcing its first overseas military base in Djibouti. Its economy was beating estimates. The country was militarizing artificial islands in the South China Sea. And most importantly, the Trump administration, with its determination to pick fights with US allies and multilateral institutions, seemed to be creating this space, this kind of leadership vacuum that was, that seemed to be China's for the taking. And at the start of that year, Xi Jinping had delivered this speech in Davos where he, preached against protectionism and called for openness and globalization and all of these things. But what was striking, I guess, during my time in Beijing was that for some reason, despite all of the opportunities that seemed to be there for the taking, China really struggled to step into that gap. And I guess, the longer that I thought about it, the more I kind of came to see Chinese diplomats as a microcosm of the struggle that China was having to communicate with the world. When you think about the kind of world that we're moving into, where US power is kind of slowly waning and there are going to be multiple centers of power around the world, the ability to persuade others, the ability to make your case and have others accept it voluntarily is going to be increasingly important. And whether or not China is able to do that is going to be really, really crucial. I guess the reason that Chinese diplomats in particular jumped out at me as a way to explore this question was that, when I would meet them in Beijing, or when I would talk to foreign diplomats who were also working in China, it was very clear that these people were highly educated, sophisticated, understood the countries that they had been posted to, spoke multiple foreign languages. Lots of them had studied overseas at all kinds of impressive universities. And yet when they got up on stage in the foreign ministry to do press conferences, or they sat down across from their foreign counterparts, suddenly they became very stilted, quite ideological, stuck extraordinarily closely to a set of predetermined and quite predictable talking points. And as the years from 2017 onwards rolled on, they also became increasingly aggressive and belligerent and assertive. And so I started to look into, where does this behavior come from? And, did lots of interviews, as many as I could in Beijing, with both Chinese subjects and with foreign diplomats, but also started to look into this set of memoirs that former Chinese diplomats had written, starting off with the memoirs of former foreign ministers, very senior people, and then using keyword searches on Baidu, I kind of discovered that there were hundreds of these things, and they're pretty terrible books. It's mostly the sort of there was one meeting, and then I had another meeting. There was another meeting after that. But kind of in between these moments of bureaucratic repetition, there are these little moments which illuminate what it was like to be on the front line of China's struggle to communicate with the world. And so I thought that there would be a book potentially based on that source material. And when I started this project in 2017, it was a pretty niche topic, and it wasn't clear that it would have a huge amount of mass appeal, but it interested me, so I decided to pursue it. And in the subsequent years, Chinese diplomats ended up storming out of international meetings, telling their interlocutors to shut up, spreading conspiracy theories on Twitter, engaging in public dress downs of their foreign counterparts, and it started to become a more mainstream topic. And this idea of wolf warrior diplomacy became a term that people used to describe that behavior. And certainly if you saw any of the confirmation hearings on Capitol Hill at the start of the Biden administration, it's clear that wolf warrior diplomacy is now front and center of the concerns that the US has, and a lot of European countries as well have, about the PRC's rise. But what's interesting, I think, when you delve into the topic, is that you realize that this behavior that we now call wolf warrior diplomacy has really very, very deep roots in China. When the People's Republic, the new communist government, was founded in 1949, China basically had no diplomats to speak of. It kicked out all of the previous government's diplomats because it believed that they were too impure to represent this new state and this new society that they wanted to build. And so they had to build a diplomatic corps from scratch. And they had to do so facing a very sort of paradoxical challenge. On the one hand, this was an underground political movement that was obsessed with secrecy, was paranoid about threats from all fronts, especially threats from the capitalist outside world. And on the other hand, it had no friends or allies outside of the Soviet bloc. And so it really needed to build bridges with the outside. And to kind of try to square that circle, the PRC's first foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, it came up with this idea that Chinese diplomats would model their behavior on the People's Liberation Army. So he said that they should think and act like the PLA in civilian clothing. And what he meant by that was that they would be unfailingly loyal to the Communist Party, they'd be disciplined to a fault, and they would display, crucially, what he called a fighting spirit whenever China's interests were challenged. And with this kind of militaristic ethos came a set of extremely distinctive behaviors, which started out in 1949, and many of which continue to dominate the way that Chinese diplomats act today, 70 years on, and after famine, revolution, economic reforms, China's rise, all of these things. So those included sticking to talking points incredibly closely, even if it was very clear that those talking points don't resonate with foreign audiences. Moving around in pairs, using this kind of buddy system to keep tabs on each other. shouting at foreign counterparts whenever they felt cornered or they were worried that they wouldn't look tough enough back home, and elevating even the smallest of incidents into major international disputes if they were concerned that they might look disloyal to the government. And this led to what we would now call displays of wolf warrior diplomacy right from the outset. So in 1950, this veteran revolutionary called Wu Xiuquan, who was one of China's first top diplomats, led a delegation to the United Nations in New York. And Wu had a bullet scar on his cheek, and he delivered this speech, which Time magazine described as 2 awful hours of rasping vituperation. And in subsequent decades in the 1960s, Chinese diplomats literally wielded axes on the streets of London and engaged in fistfights as they tried to promote Mao Zedong's message of global revolution. But at the same time as that kind of wolf warrior tendency, there's this other approach that Chinese diplomats have taken, which is an effort to kind of charm the world and to win it over. And depending on the priorities that the top leadership in Beijing set, Chinese diplomats are capable of taking this extraordinary discipline that they have and applying it to that kind of charm offensive mode. And so we saw that happen in the 1950s when China made friends across the developing world, and we saw it happen with great effect in the 1990s after the Tiananmen massacre, when China launched a kind of 2-decade charm offensive, which culminated in it hosting the 2008 Summer Olympic Games in Beijing. So these kind of 2 tendencies cycled in and out, and since 2008. And especially since 2012, we've seen a lurch back toward that kind of assertiveness and that the kind of combative style of diplomacy we've all grown used to. And I think that there are 2 things that have driven that. On the one hand, there is this new confidence that China has, and on the other hand, there are these enduring insecurities which have stemmed from 1949 and lasted all the way. So the new confidence really started after the Olympics, and especially after the global financial crisis, when China looked at the kind of lackluster response of many Western countries, compared it with its own very decisive response, launching a massive economic stimulus package, and began to think, maybe there's something to the way our system works, and maybe we don't need to listen to lectures from pious people in the West anymore. And at the same time, there were these continued worries about regime security and political stability, which were exacerbated by the Arab Spring in 2011. And Xi Jinping came in, and he kind of made the new assertiveness, which had begun to show itself in the way that China handled territorial disputes and the way that China spoke at international meetings before he came to power. He took that and he made it more consistent and more assertive. And he launched a sweeping anti-corruption campaign at home, which has punished more than 1.5 million officials. He has experimented with re-education camps in Western China. He's abolished presidential term limits, making himself, de facto leader for life. And when Chinese diplomats look at these signals, they understand that, in the past, we've faced purges and we've faced political upheaval in the foreign ministry, and that's not worked out very well for us. So we better listen this time. And anyone who is ambitious or anyone who just wants to look after themselves in this system is going to take his words very seriously. So that means that when President Xi gives speeches, as he does frequently, where he talks about how China is moving toward the center of the world stage, China has a model that other people should emulate. China will never be bullied by foreigners. And he takes this very combative very strident tone, Chinese diplomats emulate that tone in the way that they interact with people. And then if they're ambitious, they add a little extra spice just for good measure and kind of maybe even push it a little bit further. And I think that goes a long way to explaining some of the behavior that we've seen from them in recent years. And I guess if one diplomat in particular kind of is emblematic of that approach, it's Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian, who was a relatively obscure figure in Pakistan and built up, very unusually for the time, big following on Twitter. And he used it to pick a public fight with former National Security Advisor, US National Security Advisor Susan Rice. And this kind of made him a star in China and rocketed him to promotion to this position of Foreign Ministry spokesperson, making him one of the most prominent faces, not just of the Foreign Ministry, but of the whole of the Chinese government around the world. And he kind of became, a symbol of what was possible if you pushed this wolf warrior diplomacy. And as he became prominent, of course, the coronavirus outbreak happened, which kind of exacerbated this, this new confidence, because clearly, in some respects, China handled the pandemic much, much better than many Western countries, but also this incredible insecurity because China was being criticized left, right, and center all around the world. And so Zhao's response was to engage in spreading an unfounded conspiracy theory about how the US Army had been responsible for starting the pandemic in Wuhan. And it led to this kind of massive outrage, caused huge consternation inside the Trump White House. But it also became a model for other diplomats. And I think of other figures like Wei Tongyo in Sweden, who was summoned to the Swedish Foreign Ministry 40 times in the space of 2 years, and said in an interview when he was asked about his kind of wolf warrior behavior, he said, "For our friends, we have fine wine, and for our enemies, we have shotguns," which I think gives you a sense of the tone that he pursues. And it's important to remember that not everyone inside China's foreign ministry or China's diplomatic apparatus likes this new tone. There have been figures who have spoken up and warned about extreme nationalism and warned about a backlash against China. And even Xi Jinping has sort of hinted a little bit in public that maybe things have gone too far and that perhaps China needs to recalibrate a little bit. But there hasn't been very much evidence of that in recent months. And really the assertiveness seems to have continued pretty much full steam. But I guess my argument is that these behaviors have very deep roots in China's political system. And actually the way that Chinese diplomats are behaving has a lot to do with the tone that Xi has set at home. And until he changes that tone, I don't see many prospects for a recalibration or an improvement in China's image overseas. So I guess I'll leave it there, and I really look forward to the Q&A.
Peter, thank you so much for that discussion. I would encourage all of you, if you haven't yet read the book, to read it. It's really an interesting read. If you have questions, I'd encourage you to put them into the Q&A or the chat starting now. I will get us kicked off with a couple questions for you, Peter, using the chair's privilege here. The first question, I'll ask them both and give you a chance to respond. The first question is about the name, Wolf Warrior Diplomacy, Wolf Warrior Diplomats. You write in your book that many diplomats kind of bristle at the name and don't really think it's appropriate. Wondering if you could talk about the origin of the name, talk about why there are objections to it, and kind of what the connotations are, and what are there any diplomats who embrace it, in fact. The second question comes to your point about, was a fine wine for friends and shotguns for enemies.
Right.
I wonder if you talk about different audiences. So we, casual observers, we often see this wolf warrior diplomacy thing, and we kind of assume a uniform message for all audiences. But certainly it seems like there's an element of kind of standing up to the West speaking maybe nicer to countries in the global South, for example. So I was wondering if you could talk about kind of variation in messaging, any patterns you might see after having done your research.
Yeah, both great questions. So in terms of the Wolf Warrior name, as far as I can tell, the first usage was on the BBC's Chinese language website. It was picked up by foreign media outlets sort of in the late, I think it was the late 2017, 2018 kind of time frame, and kind of spread as this meme. Because it the name itself comes from this 2017 blockbuster movie called Wolf Warrior 2, which was about, it was kind of like a Rambo style thing, and was about Chinese heroes battling foreign enemies on the continent of Africa. And that movie was incredibly successful inside China because it seemed to capture, I think, this sense that China's moment had come, and that the country was going to be able to speak to the world and engage with the world using a confidence that was befitting of its new great power status. And so that movie was incredibly successful, and it seemed also to work as a way to describe this new swagger, I guess, for want of a better word, on the part of Chinese diplomats. This sense that, like, we don't need to listen to your sanctimonious content anymore, and we're going to do things our way. So I guess that's where the term comes from. And in Chinese diplomats, I think, have tended to bristle at it because this is quite hard to get your head around if you're looking at it from the outside, because they seem so confident, and they act as if their behavior comes from a position of strength. But when you see the world from their perspective, actually they feel like they're being sort of much more defensive and just simply standing up for themselves. So think about the situation they found themselves in 2017, 18, 19 with the Trump administration. You had a constant barrage of criticism against China's economic policies. You had Trump administration officials explicitly saying that their policy aimed to prevent China's economy from developing or ever overtaking the United States. You had Secretary of State Mike Pompeo talking about how Communist Party rule was illegitimate, and the US should work to undermine its grip on power. And you had other countries, during the pandemic also piling on and criticizing China. And so Chinese diplomats really felt under attack during this period, and they felt like it was their right to stand up and push back. And so this Wolf Warrior label to them feels like, we're just standing up for ourselves and you're calling us names. So I think that's where some of the concern comes from. I think there are people who kind of relish the title. China's former ambassador in London, Liu Xiaoming, talked about how if the world is dominated by wolves, then you have to act like a wolf. There are certainly people in the Global Times, the kind of nationalist tabloid in Beijing, who like the term. But on the whole, the reception's been pretty negative. The behavior in terms of audiences. So when you're a Chinese, any diplomat, right, whether you're from the US or the Ireland, France, whatever, you have to keep multiple audiences in mind when you speak. There's the person in the room with you. There's the public in the country that's hosting you, and you've also got your audience back home. So all diplomats have to kind of speak at all times to multiple different audiences. I think for Chinese diplomats, the emphasis tends to be more on the home audience than it would be for other foreign diplomats. And so there's kind of a difference of emphasis there. And under Xi Jinping, as I was saying earlier, that the assumption is that the home audience is looking for a tough, strident tone in a way that wasn't true under Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao, who had this theme of like a harmonious world and building friendships and that kind of thing. When it comes to overseas audiences, I think that there is a lot of difference between countries. I think some of the very harshest messages have kind of been reserved for middle powers who are friendly to the United States. So think Canada, France, Australia, Britain, and so when those countries are critical of China, Chinese diplomats feel emboldened to kind of lash out at will and are not too concerned about the consequences. When it comes to the US, there's always this recognition that at the end of the day, it's the biggest economy in the world, has the most powerful military in the world, and there needs to be a little bit more restraint in the way that China deals with it. And when it comes to the global South, the messaging has tended to be much softer on the whole. I mean, that's not true everywhere, right? There are a billion people in India who would strongly disagree with that. And Chinese diplomats have engaged in wolf warrior tactics in places ranging from Fiji to Papua New Guinea to Venezuela to Brazil. But on the whole, the message tends to be a little bit more focused on cooperation with developing countries.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We have now a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to kind of either give them to you directly, or maybe if there's some on similar themes, I might kind of group them together. So we have a question. If you can't answer this, that's okay. But we are sitting here in Ireland, which was the site of the infamous, by the way, China is not a lamb tweet a few months ago.
One of my favorites. Yeah,
yeah, really remarkable almost a piece of performance art. Is there any has Ireland come across your radar at all in your research in terms of wolf warrior diplomacy? And maybe I'll gather a couple questions together and give you a chance to respond to kind of all of them. And if Ireland hasn't, that's okay. But you know, I feel like we should ask that. The second kind of question is, there have been a number of questions here about kind of signals from the leadership, signals from Xi Jinping himself, and the extent to which he might be able to change the messaging. So there was this announcement at the end of May, for example, about presenting a more lovable image of China, but also sort of a mixed message about that there's a public opinion struggle going on. So I guess the question is kind of how much control does the central leadership have over this? How quickly can they turn it on and off? The third question, and then I'll hand it over to you, is does it work? And I guess that kind of implies an assumption of what it's supposed to achieve. So maybe it's a broader question about what the outcomes are of this kind of diplomacy. Okay.
All right. So in terms of Ireland, the first thing that comes to mind actually is not wolf warrior diplomacy. It was this period in the 1980s when Chinese diplomats went overseas, and China had engaged in this period of the beginning of its period of economic reform and opening, and was looking for countries that might provide lessons that China could apply at home. And so it was really fascinating actually reading about China's then ambassador to Ireland, who made a visit to, I think it's the Shannon Free Trade Zone, and kind of took notes on the way that worked, sent them back to Beijing, and it subsequently became a model for the way that China would use its own free trade zones domestically. So that I thought was a really kind of fascinating and in many ways sort of like forgotten story about how quite a major part of China's economic reform and opening process and frankly China's rise was fueled by ideas that originated in Ireland. In terms of the wolf warrior stuff, you'll have kept a much closer watch on this me. My impression, kind of from afar, is that Chinese diplomats stationed there have used Twitter in particular as kind of a platform to perform for Beijing. And so much of their consternation has actually been focused on the US and the West writ large, rather than Ireland per se. But I think for a lot of diplomats around the world who are stationed in places that maybe aren't on the front lines of conflict between China and the West, they've tended to see Twitter as a place where they can establish a little bit of prominence and show Beijing that they too are on message with this new tone, and they too are fighting discourse, or what China would call discourse battles, and that kind of thing. So that's kind of my my impression of Ireland in terms of like public wolf warrior diplomacy. In private, the few interviews that I have done suggest that, and this is maybe a year out of date now, so things may have changed, but when I spoke to Irish diplomats about their experiences during the pandemic, the foreign ministry on the whole had been quite calm and friendly and warm toward Irish diplomats. And this is at the same time as I was speaking to people from France and Britain who encountered Chinese diplomats kind of ranting and raving and shouting in meetings. Those same people who dealt with Western Europe in the foreign ministry would meet with their Irish counterparts and would be quite lovely and friendly, which I guess, does speak to your point about audiences a little bit. In terms of central leadership control, I think it's fair to say that the central leadership has a great deal of control over the overall tone that Chinese diplomats are taking. It's quite clear to me, at least, that Chinese diplomats are working towards Xi Jinping's wishes when they engage in wolf warrior diplomacy. And he has actually, he wrote at one point a handwritten note to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs telling them to use a fighting spirit when they engage with the world. And so they believe that they're on message with him. But like any large bureaucracy, there's a principal agent issue, right? There's what the leadership wants in spirit, and then there's the detail of how individual actors put that into practice. And I think in terms of like Twitter in particular, and I'm especially thinking of that Zhao Lijian series of tweets where he spread the coronavirus conspiracy theory. My understanding is that Zhao did not have any kind of pre-approval before he did that, and that it wasn't approved by his superiors in the foreign ministry, let alone the top leadership in Beijing. And so I think we've kind of seen the tactics get out ahead of where Beijing would have wanted. And in some ways, that speech from Xi Jinping, where he talked about cultivating a more lovable image, I think was an acknowledgement that in some individual cases things have got out of hand, and that there's been too much backlash for comfort. So I had expected to see, on the basis of that speech, more recalibration. I didn't really expect like a softening of China's message. I think Xi Jinping seems to quite like the abrasive tone, but I had expected to see more consistency and kind of a little bit more caution in the way that that Chinese diplomats interacted with the world. But as you'll remember, I think it was the week immediately, after Xi's speech, a Chinese diplomat posted an image of an outstretched middle finger, and he said this is what China does to its detractors, or something extraordinary like that. And we've seen clearly quite a lot of sort of wolf warrior tactics since then, extending to an assistant foreign minister essentially handing Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman a list of homework when she met with him on how to improve ties. In terms of does it work, I guess it depends on what you think it's trying to achieve. I think it's worked in terms of Chinese diplomats demonstrating to Xi Jinping that they're on board with his agenda, and that there was this kind of, for a long time, this sense that the foreign ministry was, from the Chinese public and from Chinese nationalists, the foreign ministry was too weak, too accommodating, and too cautious in the way that it dealt with the world. And I think that the Wolf Warriors have successfully demonstrated to those people and to people like Xi Jinping that it's capable of acting in a new and assertive way, which is in line with his wishes. In terms of whether it works with foreign audiences, I think, on the whole, the answer is no. It seems, as far as I can tell, to have done a great deal to have damaged China's image. It's come together, with a kind of set of policies which have caused a great backlash against China, ranging from the way that China's industrial policy promotes state-owned enterprises, through to military assertiveness, the way that it's pursued territorial claims in the South China Sea, the abolition of presidential term limits, the crackdowns in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, all of which have angered people in the West. And I think what the Wolf Warriors have done is put a human face on that assertiveness. For a long time, there was kind of this misfit between China's behavior and then the very kind of bland way that it talked about its behavior. And now those two things have kind of come together. And I think the Wolf Warriors have done a lot there. But I guess, if there's one area where they've succeeded, it's in terms of providing even greater clarity about the idea that if countries cross China, there will be consequences. I think the world was already pretty clear that, like, China has a hard red line on Taiwan, one on Tibet, and one on Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and etc. But the Wolf Warriors have perhaps made that even sharper for people.
Yeah, very interesting sort of comments. I mean, in any one of these topics we could unpack for a long period of time. So I'm trying to discipline myself to not ask you a bunch of follow-up questions, because we have a lot of interesting questions coming in. I'll give you a few more and ask you to respond. One is from a colleague in the UCD School of History, Jenny Bond. She's asking about continuities between pre-49 China and post-49 China, particularly, and you kind of addressed this a little bit in your remarks, but maybe you could go a little bit deeper for folks who are interested in those historical developments. Kind of what does the party's role as an insurgent force, and having built its base in Yan'an, have to do with kind of how do we explain those continuities, and what breaks might there be as well? So we have the historical question. We have a question about whether, you mentioned some diplomats have kind of spoken out against this sort of assertiveness and nationalism. Have they faced any penalties? Is there now a ceiling on their career or anything like that? And the third question is about repression of Uyghurs. This is obviously one of the major kind of international news stories about China in the last couple of years. Can you talk a little bit about the Wolf Warrior kind of strategy or playbook when it comes to that repression? Thanks.
Sorry, can you repeat the Uyghur question again?
Yeah, so there was a question about what the Wolf Warrior kind of strategy about criticism of China's repression of Uyghurs over the last few years has been. I mean, this has been one of the major news stories about China, like international news stories about China in the last few years. So it's been something that Wolf Warrior diplomats have said something about. I'm wondering if you can talk about the strategy or the kind of rhetorical response that has that's been characteristic of Wolf Warriors.
Yeah, so I love the question on kind of continuity and change, and I guess a couple of things jump out to me. So one, I know your question was about the communists before the revolution and afterwards, but one thing that kind of tangentially to that, which kind of comes to mind, is the idea that actually there are also thematic continuities between the nationalist government that was that ran China from Nanjing before the revolution, and the communists afterwards. And the key one is this idea of national humiliation, the idea that China was a once great nation, which went through this period of being bullied and oppressed by foreign powers, and that it was the duty of whoever ruled China to kind of avenge that fate and to make China great again, I guess, for want of a better phrase. That is something that China's former leader Chiang Kai-shek used to write in his diary. Avenge national humiliation. He'd write it again and again. And it's something that Mao Zedong, when he became leader of China in 1949, also promised to remedy. He famously said China has stood up in a speech that year. And that theme and that source of using national humiliation as a way to legitimize government's rule has extraordinarily deep roots, which go far beyond the propaganda efforts of the Communist Party. So that's one thing. There is also incredible continuity between the way that the party conducted its foreign affairs pre-1949 and post-1949. And I think that the key reason for that is that the communists had a playbook they were working from. They learned a great deal from the way that the Soviet Union conducted its foreign policy, both in terms of the way that you organize a foreign policy bureaucracy and the way that you, kind of more specific tactics. So one example of that is this use of quote unquote friendship diplomacy, and united front, what they call united front work, which is this idea that if you can't persuade a foreign government to get on board with your agenda, perhaps you can find people in that country's society who are amenable to your message, and you seek them out, you provide them with a degree of access and an incredibly warm reception that you don't afford to others, and that perhaps sometimes they kind of target like journalists whose careers are on the out or academics who aren't super prominent, and they give them this platform to which allows them to kind of have a new lease of life in their career. China has been doing, did it famously with a journalist called Edgar Snow in the 1930s, who went on to write this book Red Star Over China, which painted he described Mao Zedong as a Lincoln-esque figure who was going to free China from oppression, and actually did a huge amount to bolster the Communist Party's international legitimacy. It's applied that same playbook subsequently to people ranging from, Henry Kissinger to Trump's ambassador to Beijing, Terry Branstad. And so there's a huge amount of continuity there, and it's not coincidental. It's because China learned from the Soviet Union, and after 1949. Chinese diplomats posted in Moscow and other parts of the Soviet bloc actually took notes from their counterparts in those countries about how you organize a foreign policy bureaucracy, sent them back to Beijing, and they were formally integrated into training manuals that were used to train Chinese diplomats. And so there is this kind of like fascinating current that in many ways Soviet foreign policy kind of lives on in China 30 years after the demise of the Soviet Union. So that's kind of my answer to the first part. In terms of consequences of speaking out, yes, there are consequences, and I think that's the reason that most people have been incredibly reluctant to do it. My impression, sort of anecdotally speaking to as many people as I can, is that actually the concerns about this new tone that China has taken are really quite widespread inside the foreign ministry and also across kind of academic circles and think tank circles in Beijing, where people deal with foreign policy. But I talked about the way that Xi Jinping has centralized power and the way that he's made it clear that he doesn't trust opposition. And so people are very, very concerned about speaking out. Those who have done so have tended to do so in quite a kind of oblique way, which hints at what they want to see happen without saying it explicitly. also very tellingly, the people who have been most explicit have either been on the cusp of retirement or already retired. So Cui Tiankai, China's former ambassador in Washington, publicly disagreed with Zhao Lijin's efforts to spread the conspiracy theory over COVID-19. But he was already past retirement age. He'd been kept on in that job after he should have retired. And, so I think he probably to some extent felt like there wasn't much to lose by doing it. In any case, he did it in quite a kind of soft and subtle way. The other really prominent example is China's former consul general in San Francisco, Yuan Nanshan, who was much more explicit in the way that he spoke about the dangers of extreme nationalism in Chinese foreign policy. But again, he's already retired, and he didn't aim his comments at Xi Jinping, right? He spoke in a very general way about what he was doing, and so in many cases, the discomfort that has been expressed publicly kind of goes to prove the point that there are risks and consequences for speaking out. And in terms of Xinjiang, it was really fascinating to watch them deal with the accusations. Actually, I remember, one of the most repetitive duties you have as a political reporter in Beijing is going to the foreign ministry's daily press briefings. It's very time consuming, and once you've done it for a few months, you can kind of rattle off the talking points yourself without needing to actually attend. But when people first started asking questions about the re-education camps in Xinjiang, the spokespeople would say, this is a set of rumors, like I've never heard this before. Then they kind of said, this is not true. There's no such thing as re-education camps. And as the months kind of progressed, and the reporting on this from journalists, but also from international organizations, the United Nations, became more and more compelling, the ministry kind of pivoted, and almost overnight, it went from saying the camps don't exist, you're spreading rumors and conspiracy theories, to these camps are a remarkable testament to Beijing's efforts to fight radicalization, and anyone who smears them is, smearing the good name of China. And it really was just this kind of like mind-blowing 180 that they did. But in that case, I don't really think it was the foreign ministry that was in the driving seat there. That this is the strategy that is being pursued in Xinjiang is being led by Politburo level officials, and certainly has the blessing of Xi Jinping. And that is way out of the foreign ministry's area of competency. And, my understanding is that the foreign ministry information office often struggles to get reliable and timely updates from other offices inside the foreign ministry for its press briefings. So when it comes to getting reliable and timely information from Xinjiang Autonomous Region led by a Politburo member, that's tough. So these guys, it was kind of interesting to watch that sudden transformation, but they weren't in the driving seat. They were very much kind of on the defensive there, and taking their lead from much more powerful figures elsewhere in the bureaucracy.
Yeah, great. So again, so many potential avenues to explore. And I want to selfishly, I want to ask you a bunch of my own questions, but we have still a lot of interesting questions coming in. So I'll pick three again. We have a number of questions about the United States, even though you've not written a book about the United States, but I guess the US is always kind of lurking in the background. One question is, as China becomes a superpower, it's going to get criticized more and more, much like the United States is criticized, all the time for its many shortcomings. How much are wolf warrior diplomats, or just diplomats generally in China, just going to have to start to live with that reality and not kind of pick small fights? The second question is about Chinese multinational corporations operating abroad. What do they think about this wolf warrior diplomacy, and does it kind of harm their operations? Would they prefer a quieter sort of approach, or has there been any, have you run across any interesting information on that topic in your research? And finally, you mentioned this a little bit when I asked you about Ireland, but maybe you could expand more how foreign diplomats interact with it. So you mentioned, interact with this kind of new assertiveness, I should say. So you mentioned, Wendy Sherman received a sort of a homework list. I mean, in the behind closed doors sort of world of diplomacy, the foreign diplomats are there, they have their own brief and they have their own, interest to defend. So how do they react to these kinds of tactics, more kind of behind closed doors?
Right. So in terms of whether China will be criticized more and more, yeah, absolutely. I think actually that's a really important observation, and it's something that Chinese diplomats don't seem to have quite internalized, as far as I can tell. I've had conversations with people where they've kind of said, "Oh, why are you guys always so positive about the US? And the US media never criticizes the US government, and but you're always picking fights with China." And it's like, are you being serious? Like, have you read reporting on the Trump administration and now the Biden administration's Afghanistan exit? There's an incredible amount of critical reporting that goes on, and the bigger your role in the world, the more people are going to assign blame to you for a variety of situations, some of which are under your control and some of which aren't. And I remember kind of saying to people, like, I was a teenager during the backlash against the start of the Iraq War, and anti-American and especially anti-American government feeling was just absolutely rampant across the Western world. But I guess the key difference is that US society, through Hong Kong, through non-profit organizations with global reach, through American businesses, its fashion industry, its tech industry, et cetera, is able to kind of maintain a dialogue with the world that feeds the way that global audiences think about the United States, which is completely independent of the US government. And I think the best recent example of that is the Black Lives Matter movement. While most of the world was pretty outraged at some of the ways that the Trump administration was behaving, US society was able to galvanize this movement, which inspired, sympathy protests everywhere from London to Bangkok, and did so totally without any backing or support from the US government. And that's a testament to the fact that the US government doesn't feel the need to be completely in control of every aspect of the way that America speaks to the world. That is not true of China. Chinese business people are not empowered to go out and speak with an independent voice that is different from the Communist Party, and Beijing has made that clear recently in the way that they have dealt with Jack Ma. Chinese civil society groups need to act in a way that is, it's largely state-led, and when it's not, it's state-controlled. China has recently launched a crackdown on various aspects of celebrity culture. China's cultural and media industries and its academic world is subject to a great deal of party and state control, and so Chinese society can't speak out in a way that's independent of the Chinese government, and so I think that means that there's more onus put on the reputation of China's government as opposed to China, writ large, and I think they find that hard to deal with and hard to kind of get their heads around, if that makes sense. In terms of Chinese multinationals, I think wolf warriors have been damaging to the extent that they have contributed to a much broader backlash against China. I don't know if I really think of Chinese diplomats being in the driving seat there. I think that, you know, that kind of list of grievances that people have, ranging from human rights to industrial policy and the centralization of power at home and so on and so forth, that constellation of policies has led to a backlash which has hurt Chinese companies. Wolf Warriors are part of that constellation of policies, but they haven't driven it, if that makes sense. I wouldn't want to overstate their importance there. And then in terms of interactions with foreign diplomats, it is quite interesting. Even before the start of the Wolf Warrior stuff, there's this extraordinary control that Chinese diplomats have over their behavior, and sometimes when we in the media write it up, you get the impression that a Chinese diplomat has like lost it in public. You know, they were so angry and their temper got out ahead of them. I think that is almost never the case. I think it's nearly always calculated and done with a great deal of self-control. So when you speak to ambassadors who have gone in for these dress downs in the foreign ministry in Beijing, they'll sit opposite someone who they've known for years. The person will start shouting and, you know, leveling all kinds of extraordinary allegations against the person sitting, you know, the foreign diplomat in the room, and we'll go through this whole list of grievances, and you must do this and you must do that to address, you know, these causes of upset in the relationship. And then when they leave the foreign ministry, the Chinese diplomat will kind of like pat them on the back, and they'll say, you know, it was so good to see you. We haven't caught up for a long time. I hope your children are well. And they'll walk them out to the car park. And, you know, it's kind of bewildering, right, to sit in one of these meetings and see the about face happen. But it's clear from those interactions that, you know, this is all like pre-planned and pretty well scripted. And so that's been kind of a long-running theme. We've seen it in Yang Jiechi, China's top diplomat, delivered this 17-minute diatribe to US Secretary of State Tony Blinken in Alaska. Apparently, when he got into the actual meeting afterwards, he was cordial, friendly, warm, and, you know, down to business. So that pattern is pretty well established. But I do think that foreign governments are tiring of it. And one of the things that President Biden said to Xi Jinping in their most recent phone call was that he complained that diplomatic engagements between the two countries have become unproductive, and you know, he kind of wanted to see a return to a kind of useful and less performative kind of dialogue. So yeah, people are getting tired of the Wolf Warriors.
Well, Peter, this was a great discussion. I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar. Hopefully we can welcome you in person in Dublin sometime to talk about your book.
I love that.
But thank you. This was really enriching for those of you who are